Americans have debated for the past half century why the U.S. lost South Vietnam to the North Vietnamese communists. The U.S. errors and misjudgments in prosecuting the war abound, but the U.S. could have done everything right and still lost the war by not confronting the North Vietnamese invasion down the Ho Chi Minh Trail of South Vietnam. Beginning in at least 1966, the North Vietnamese began invading the South by infiltrating 100,000 fighters and tons of war material each year down the trail, a slow, steady, deadly invasion that tightened the noose around the South Vietnamese neck and ultimately doomed the war effort. This invasion through Laos was the primary defeat mechanism the communists used to conquer South Vietnam by their own admission. And this video shows you how the U.S. knew this invasion through Laos was the primary threat, why the U.S. failed to confront it, and the specific plans the U.S. had but failed to implement to counter the invasion. Hi, I'm Dr. Paul T. Carter coming to you from Bangkok. Thank you for watching. In this video, I'm going to show you how, if the U.S. government would have adopted a proposal early on in the Vietnam War, a recommendation that many high-ranking civilians up to the ambassadorial and Joint Chiefs of Staff level proposed to place U.S. combat capability into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, rather than squandering our combat capability in South Vietnamese jungles chasing an elusive enemy, the U.S. would have been in a much better position to prevail in the war. And I detail the particulars of why, and I detail how these measures were not only within U.S. capability, but played to U.S. strengths, more so than fighting within the confines of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese stated, I will show you their statements, that they were fighting a war of attrition against the U.S. This was also the U.S. military strategy. A strategic requirement for an attrition strategy requires one to isolate the enemy's battle space to prevent him from reinforcing and resupplying his forces. Otherwise, you never attrit the enemy. Fairly simple concept, actually. But the U.S. did not isolate the enemy's battle space in Laos or anywhere else, and therefore the U.S. could not win a war of attrition. As U.S. forces were forbidden to mount a ground challenge there, the North Vietnamese used the sanctuary of Laos to reinforce, to resupply, to invade South Vietnam. I'm going to show you a film clip later of a famous Vietnam War battle, later made into a book and movie, that will graphically illustrate this problem. I do not argue that achieving this operational objective alone, stopping the northern invasion down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, would have won the war. The measure of cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail is not an overall strategy, rather it's a military objective. But I do argue that without cutting the trail or stopping or severely degrading the northern invasion, it was impossible to win the war. Perhaps most sadly, as I will also show you, there were many high-ranking voices telling this to the president and his advisors at the time, that the U.S. must place combat capability into Laos to challenge the North Vietnamese. North Vietnamese Bui Tin had fought with the Communist Viet Minh since 1945 and took the Saigon surrender in 1975. By 1995, he had become disillusioned with North Vietnamese communist leadership and exiled in Paris. He was direct in his assessment of the Ho Chi Minh Trail contribution to Hanoi's victory. In a 1995 Wall Street Journal interview, when asked how the U.S. could have won the war, he replied, "Cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside of Laos. If Johnson would have granted Westmoreland's request to enter Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Hanoi could not have won the war." Bui Tin's response echoes the belief of some American military and civilian leaders both during and after the war. That is, Hanoi's use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail to extend its combat power into South Vietnam was the single most important factor to their success. In January 1961, the day before President Kennedy's inauguration, President Eisenhower told Kennedy that Laos was the key to Southeast Asia and its defense was imperative. And specifically regarding the meeting, President Eisenhower said with considerable emotion that Laos was the key to the entire area of Southeast Asia. He said that if we permitted Laos to fall, then we would have to write off all the area. As he concluded these remarks, President Eisenhower stated it was imperative that Laos be defended. He said that the United States should accept this task with our allies if we could persuade them, and alone if we could not. There is general agreement that by at least 1967, the North Vietnamese had begun pushing 100,000 or more fighters each year down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for infiltration into South Vietnamese jungles. Once infiltrated into South Vietnam, these North Vietnamese regulars, disguised as insurgents, fought on decisively favorable terrain, ground severely constricting for U.S. soldiers. Often modern accounts of the war seem to treat this communist infiltration, more accurately an invasion, as an inescapable nuance, while analyzing U.S. foundering on the more remedial tasks such as insurgency, Saigon government reform, or other ailments. But during the war, a thoughtful group of capable American leaders, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, Walt Rostow, General Maxwell Taylor, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, among others, viewed this infiltration as the primary war problem and proposed a common solution: deployment of U.S. combat troops into Laos to establish a DMZ-like zone on or near the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos to challenge the infiltration. Such an operation would have been no small endeavor, some say needlessly escalating the war through introduction of U.S. ground troops into yet another country. Each time, proposed variations of this plan were rejected. But as we analyze U.S. Vietnam War failures, we cannot escape three key questions that surround the issues that this operation and those who proposed it sought to address. If the nature of the Vietnam conflict was primarily insurgency or even civil war, why did the North Vietnamese require 5 conventional force invasions, all facilitated by the Ho Chi Minh Trail infiltration, over a period of 7 years to finally topple Saigon? 3 of these invasions were in 1968, the next was the 1972 Easter Offensive, and the final and 5th one was in 1975, 2 years after the U.S. had left. Even former President Richard Nixon said, "We fail to understand that the war was an invasion from North Vietnam and not an insurgency in the South." Why did the North Vietnamese leaders determine early in the war, which I will show you, that the only choice for victory was to deploy sizable North Vietnamese People's Army of Vietnam units, PAVN, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the South? Finally, is it reasonable to expect victory while failing to confront the enemy's combat reinforcement? I think not. While Hanoi was executing a theater-wide strategy, the U.S. government imposed severe geographic restrictions on U.S. forces. General Bruce Palmer, Jr., a U.S. Army Corps commander and Army Chief of Staff during the war, observed, quote, "The United States, having decided to limit the ground war to South Vietnam and therefore unable to block enemy positions moving through Laos, could not prevent an enemy buildup within or on the borders of South Vietnam. They remained back in base sanctuaries in Cambodia or Laos, going on the attack only when they so decided, seeking to surprise a pre-selected victim. Thus, the enemy clearly had the initiative." For all of North Vietnam's rhetorical flourish that military action can only succeed when politics are correct, its final military offensives to seize South Vietnam sidelined such preconditions. Merle L. Pribenow, translator of Hanoi's Official History of the People's Army of Vietnam, observed that on the PAVN's final offensive, North Vietnamese leadership, quote, "paid only lip service to the old dogma of popular uprising. The PAVN finally mounted a campaign worthy of the modern professional army the Vietnamese communist leadership worked so long to build." Former senior North Vietnamese officers offered some insights into their practical strategy for the war. Bui Tin told author Stanley Carnell that in late 1963, Hanoi sent him into South Vietnam to survey the situation. traveling the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There he found the Viet Cong poorly organized and lacking in leadership, their ranks thinned and unprepared for an intensive campaign. To train the Viet Cong for a larger conflict would have been impossible. Bui Tin concluded that the only choice for the communists was to send sizable North Vietnamese contingents into the South. We had to move from the guerrilla phase into conventional war, otherwise our future would have been bleak. Returning north in 1964 along the trail, his report confirmed a decision Northern leaders had already made. Turn the trail into a modern logistical system to deploy PAVN troops south, with hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, food, and other necessities for major battles. Later, he reiterated his contention to a television interviewer.
During the final months of 1963, Diem was shot and Kennedy was assassinated. So the situation in the South changed. Just at that time, President Ho Chi Minh called on all Vietnamese to double their efforts to help the people in the South. The resistance forces in the South were still very weak and badly equipped. In certain areas, they had trouble recruiting troops. Therefore, we decided that well-equipped and larger forces had to be sent to the South.
The order was given to speed up the flow of men and weapons to the NLF in the South. In 1959, a specialized North Vietnamese Army unit, Group 559, had been formed to create a supply route from the north to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Jungle trails inside the South had proved too vulnerable to government army sweeps, and so, helped by their allies, the Pathet Lao guerrillas in Laos, and with the tacit approval of Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia, Group 559 had taken over the border areas just outside South Vietnam. A primitive route was developed, soon known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, with offshoots into Vietnam along its entire length. By early 1964, the trail was being transformed into a secret jungle highway with depots, air defense, and garrisons of permanent logistics troops.
In 1990, former North Vietnamese General Tran Van Tra, who during the war was the field commander of military operations in the South, the equivalent to General Westmoreland, stated that he and Hanoi were proponents of the Big Unit Main Force War. From the 1965-66 dry season campaign on, the PAVN commander, General Giap, and Hanoi agreed that the military campaign would be a main force war and not guerrilla war. He said, strategically, it was a war of attrition. Tactically, we tried to destroy U.S. units. U.S. officials understood bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail was having little effect. In July 1968, the U.S. Defense Department wrote that despite a four-fold increase in U.S. air attacks against communist forces in Laos and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the bombing was ineffective, and the North Vietnamese had actually increased their output and overall activity. But U.S. bombing continued to increase to no avail, and by the late 1960s, American air crews were flying 300 attack missions per day against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail had such massive transport capacity that some U.S. officials called it the, quote, W. Averill Harriman Expressway, unquote, while General Westmoreland preferred the moniker Sullivan's Freeway. These were derisive terms signifying that these diplomats had used their authority to stop the U.S. from conducting operations in Laos. The trail was not a road but a state of mind, said one military observer, while General Creighton D. Abrams, who succeeded Westmoreland, compared it to a python swallowing a pig. In fact, one can track the 1968 North Vietnamese Tet Offensive battles just by superimposing the battles onto a Ho Chi Minh Trail map. By 1971, the network had lateral tributaries and outlets extending 12,000 miles with 40 to 50,000 North Vietnamese organized into 16 logistical commands moving supplies and men south, according to the CIA. A separate CIA assessment stated that during the 1970-71 dry season, the North Vietnamese had extended the Ho Chi Minh Trail mileage by an astounding 30%. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger informed President Nixon in early 1971 that from 1965 to 1970, the North Vietnamese used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to infiltrate into South Vietnam at least 630,000 PAVN troops, at least 200 million pounds of foodstuffs, in excess of 400,000 weapons, and over 600 million rounds of ammunition. No application of proper counterinsurgency techniques could have parried this invasion. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk told the U.S. Congress that had all the PAVN infiltrators crossed the line at once, as the North Koreans did with 75,000 soldiers in 1950, it's difficult to see how anyone could deny this assault on South Vietnam was anything but an invasion. He further stated, "There can be no serious question as to the existence and nature of this aggression. The war is clearly an armed attack, cynically and systematically mounted by the Hanoi regime against the people of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese regime has sought deliberately to confuse the issue by seeking to make its aggression appear as an indigenous revolt. Failure to place U.S. troops in Laos ceded more advantage to Hanoi than continual reinforcements to the south. The North Vietnamese used eastern Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail for staging, sanctuary, storage, refitting, rest, maintenance, training, and even food. During the siege of Khe Sanh in 1968, the North Vietnamese fired heavy artillery from Laos sanctuaries to support their attacks. During the ill-fated South Vietnamese Lam Son 719 operation into Laos in 1971, the North Vietnamese Base Area 604 was discovered. It contained 26 cache sites, 8 base camps, 3 hospitals, 23 storage areas, 20 truck parks, 59 anti-aircraft artillery positions, 220 bunkers, 817 fuel barrels, 7 2,000-gallon fuel storage tanks, 33 kilometers of fuel pipeline, and 1 fuel pumping station and 3 surface-to-air missile sites. A year earlier, when U.S. forces invaded Cambodia, they found a similar site containing 18 mess halls, food facilities, and enough weapons to outfit a PAVN regiment. All such sites had essentially gone unchallenged during the war, except for inconsequential aerial bombing. No sooner had the ink dried on the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 than the North Vietnamese began planning for the next southern offensive. The invasion would be one of enormous proportions, Hanoi's fifth and final one. The trail now contained modern truck parks, machine shops, petroleum pipelines, and fueling stations, with anti-aircraft and gun emplacements ringing the hills along the route. According to North Vietnamese General Hong Van Thai, from November 1973 to July 1974, Hanoi pushed 180,000 troops south while removing wounded and ill. Additionally, they transported 25 armored and artillery units, hundreds of thousands of tons of military and civilian cargo, and drafted plans to transport more than 500,000 additional tons of cargo. The North Vietnamese in mid-1974 had 400,000 PAVN troops poised in Laos and South Vietnam, ready to launch, all units at full strength, according to Thai. So how would this plan to cut the trail have worked? There were several variations over the years, but the most developed plan was Operation El Paso. From November 1967 to March 1968, Westmoreland's staff elements planned the corps-size operation, heavy on engineering assets. The North Vietnamese were very vulnerable at one location where the branches of the trail were forced to come together, Chapon, Laos. The trail was the dictate of geography, and here the trail system converged at two choke points in very restricting and canalizing terrain. A 10-mile radius centered on Chapone and an area around what was known as the Four Corners, several miles southeast of Chapone. The terrain forced all men and supplies moving south through these two choke points. There was no other choice. Whoever controlled these choke points controlled the flow of men and material south. By choking off the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, the U.S. and ARVN forces would no longer need to protect a border with North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that stretched over 1,400 miles. They would be able to instead concentrate their forces along a frontage of only 225 miles, the distance from the East China Sea to the Mekong River. The terrain west of Chapone is open, no cover and concealment, making observation of any Vietnamese attempt to flank easy to detect and attack. There were no Mekong River bridges or river fords in Laos, making this area a very significant obstacle for the North Vietnamese. A military planner for the El Paso Plan said later, "The El Paso mission was the soul of simplicity. The task force would seize, secure, and as long as necessary, block choke points astride the trail." With the U.S. occupying this terrain, the North Vietnamese, to breach U.S. defenses, would have to fight a frontal attack in the open with conventional forces in terrain heavily favoring the defense, using a 3-to-1 numeric advantage. The force levels needed to defend this Dong Ha to Savannakhet axis, as it was called, would have been less than those the U.S. employed by pursuing an attrition-based strategy in South Vietnam. By 1969, the U.S. employed 11 division equivalents in South Vietnam with over 500,000 troops. The plan to establish this defensive barrier would require only 2 U.S. Marine divisions in Quang Tri Province and 4 U.S. Army divisions in southern Laos, with an additional U.S. Army division positioned in the vicinity of either Pak Sen, Laos, or Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, where it could screen the Mekong River north of Savannakhet, Laos, and threaten the right flank of any North Vietnamese force moving against the barrier to the south. The Dong Ha Savannakhet defensive barrier could logistically be maintained through the port of Da Nang, C-130 capable Lao airfields, and Royal Thai Air Force bases in eastern Thailand. Military engineers could make the Muang Nong airfield C-23 capable in 2 weeks' time. Who were the plan proponents? According to presidential advisor Roger Hilsman, in 1961, General Maxwell Taylor, later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ambassador to Saigon, recommended that the U.S. force mission in Vietnam should be to man the northern borders to stop North Vietnamese infiltration, allowing ARVN to fight the insurgency. That year, Walt Rostow, later National Security Advisor to President Johnson, proposed placing an international force of about 25,000 men in South Vietnam to seal the border. The Joint Chiefs of Staff instead recommended sending 3 Army divisions plus supporting units to Laos, stating what is needed is not the spreading out of our forces throughout Southeast Asia, but rather a concentrated effort in Laos where a firm stand can be taken, saving all or substantially all of Laos, which would at the same time protect Thailand and protect the borders of South Vietnam. General John K. Waters, commanding general U.S. Army Pacific during this period, also favored the plan. Waters, who was General Patton's son-in-law, retired from the Army and published an article in the December 19, 1966 U.S. News and World Report advocating the action. The time has long been overdue for the United States to take the necessary action on the ground to isolate the South Vietnamese battlefields and interdict the enemy on the ground. The Ho Chi Minh Trail has never been cut, and the enemy has had unlimited and free access to his various combat zones on down through Laos and Cambodia. The back door has never been closed, and we are in a major war. The same magazine issue stated the Pentagon had done a study on such a proposal in August 1965 and concluded it would take about 350,000 men. a figure too high for the Pentagon to commit to. 4 years later, as an incremental but steady increase of U.S. troops to South Vietnam began to materialize, others proposed similar plans. 1 week after 3,500 U.S. Marines swept ashore at Da Nang in March 1965, General Harold Johnson, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, proposed a 4-division force comprised of U.S. and SEATO troops along the DMZ and into Laos to contain North Vietnamese infiltration of men and supplies. President Johnson deferred the proposal, but met with General Johnson and the other service chiefs the next day, urging them to, quote, kill more Viet Cong, unquote. U.S. Military Assistance Command, Thailand, in January 1966, proposed isolating the South Vietnam battlefield by cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam Ellsworth Bunker urged placing troops in Laos to choke off the trail. In a June 1967 cable, he told President Johnson it was apparent that stopping PAVN infiltration would drastically reduce the dimensions of our problem in South Vietnam. Militarily, we would be dealing only with the Viet Cong, whose problems of recruitment and supplies would be enormously multiplied, lacking the assistance and reinforcements of North Vietnam. Bunker in subsequent cables continued to press the point, saying the U.S. should execute whatever new tactics are necessary to stop or slow the infiltration to a trickle. A post-war interview with Ambassador Bunker. I sent a message recommending that we go into Laos and cut the trail on the ground, that the war was kept alive, of course, in the South by the infiltration of men and supplies and material and equipment, reasoning that if we would cut the trail that the Viet Cong in the South would wither on the vine. Well, obviously I was turned down. They never did it on several grounds. Let's review a video clip that illustrates the point that enemy sanctuary inside Laos and Cambodia allowed the North Vietnamese to regulate violence levels and thus control their attrition. By way of introduction, Krapinovich details how the Pentagon concluded in a study during the war that communist forces initiated 88% of all engagements. This meant the enemy generally could choose the time and place of battle, regulating his casualties. Krapinovich writes that thus the enemy had the initiative. Quote, they could either refuse or accept battle on their terms, unquote. This condition represents absolute failure in trying to win a war. One North Vietnamese colonel stated, quote, usually we could get away because we knew the countryside so well and we could get out fast. That happened at Soi Cut, where they, the Americans, destroyed 3 villages while they were trying to catch us. The following film clip details the Ia Drang Battle, November 1965, from which a book and movie were made.
By September 1965, 2 North Vietnamese Army regiments, the 32nd and the 33rd, had moved down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and infiltrated from Cambodia into South Vietnam. The 66th Regiment was following close behind. The plan was to take the provincial capital, Pleiku, and advance along Highway 19 to the coast at Quy Nhon, splitting the South in 2. The Americans were determined to block the NVA's attempt to reach Quy Nhon. The idea was to place in the An Khe Valley the most mobile force they possessed, the 1st Air Cavalry Division. After infiltrating into the south, the 32nd and the 33rd North Vietnamese regiments had established a base area on the high ground of the Chupong Massif. On October 20th, 1965, the 33rd Regiment laid siege to an American Special Forces camp at Plai Mai. After a siege that lasted 6 days, the South Vietnamese Army, backed by the U.S. Air Cavalry, secured that camp, and both NVA regiments withdrew to the Chupong. There, they meant to join with the newly arrived 66th Regiment before renewing their campaign. The American plan was to fly in the whole of the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry to find the NVA regiments. It was the first time U.S. troops would face NVA regulars. The first step was to create an artillery fire support base near the Chu Pong at Landing Zone Falcon. Next, the lead elements of the 1st Battalion landed at LZ X-ray. Right in front of them were nearly all the 66th and 33rd NVA regiments.
This first major battle between the U.S. Army and PAVN was an overwhelming victory for the U.S. But what happened next?
Conceding defeat, the shattered North Vietnamese regiments began to pull back towards the E Trang Valley in the safety of Cambodia.
The PAVN retreated to the safety of Cambodian sanctuary, where they were untouchable, licking their wounds, refitting and formulating lessons learned so they could attack again, but only at a time and location of their choosing. North Vietnamese infiltration of 100,000 or so fresh troops into the South each year significantly altered the force balance in Hanoi's favor, replenishing its stock of fighters killed, wounded, captured, or naturally attrited. In trying to calculate the combat power these fresh infiltrators brought to Hanoi's fight, a more sobering perspective is achieved by asking what the South Vietnamese battlefield would have looked like in 1971 if the 630,000 PAVN and war material had not been introduced onto the South Vietnamese battlefield the previous 5 years. No mathematical equation is necessary to conclude the environment would have been much more favorable to the South Vietnamese and U.S. We will conclude this video in the following order. Why blocking positions in Laos would have played to U.S. strengths. Some myths we must dispel regarding the war as it pertains to this issue. Why the Johnson administration ultimately never approved plans to fight in Laos, and post-war reflections on this subject. Here are some advantages to establishing a linear defense to stop or severely degrade the North Vietnamese infiltration and why it was in U.S. capability to do so. Drawing a line on a map and defending terrain in depth is a mission U.S. soldiers can understand and for which our military systems and tactics are geared. The dominance of terrain in determining battle outcomes is well established, and a DMZ continues to work in Korea. A linear defense in depth has an advantage of simplicity, a clear contest of defense against aggression measured by the military front line. Holding defensible terrain also provides a nation a tangible point to begin negotiations when the time arrives. In 1973, the U.S. had not only run out of time, but had no space from which to bargain. Contrast the effectiveness of occupying terrain vice temporarily seizing inconsequential objectives of no military value, such as Hamburger Hill, site of an infamous battle in May 1969. U.S. forces seized the objective after a costly 10-day fight, only to abandon it 2 weeks later. Military missions such as roving patrols in unfamiliar jungles to close with and destroy an unseen enemy absent stable terrain features sapped U.S. soldier morale. An additional benefit for U.S. forces defending a line in Laos would have been less complex and better understood rules of engagement. A defensive zone is not an area for travel. Friendly troops know it, civilians know it, the enemy knows it. As a planner stated regarding the El Paso plan, the mission itself was not complex. It was to seize, secure, and hold terrain, preventing enemy penetration, one of the most basic missions the Army conducts. This DMZ concept has worked for 70 years in Korea. Consider a rule of engagement for troops defending a DMZ behind a line of fortifications. Joe, this is a DMZ, a no man's land. Anything comes down that road, you kill it. This is obviously an oversimplification, but compare that, defending a line, a skill taught in Army basic training, to the complexity of decision-making while patrolling and taking enemy fire, and then entering a village only to find it absent military-aged males with enough food to feed an armed battalion. What could they do? Well, nothing. This sapped soldier morale and led to frustration. Retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Douglas Kennard surveyed his fellow generals after the Vietnam War and found the rules of engagement were not very well understood, nor were they carefully adhered to. Another advantage to fighting in Laos would be a change to defense for strategic advantage. The example of a change in strategy from offensive to defensive operations to gain strategic advantage came from America's previous conflict in Korea. During the first 2 years of the Korean conflict, U.S. forces suffered painful maneuvers up and down the peninsula and a costly seesaw campaign yielding little strategic result. In late November 1951, General Matthew Ridgway devised a new strategy. The U.S. 8th Army ceased offensive operations and formed an active defensive line across the front. The only offensive operations authorized were engagements to enhance the defense. Ridgway tied his defenses to favorable terrain across the peninsula that afforded clear observation in intersecting fields of fire and dug in. The enemy heavily attacked this defensive line throughout 1952 and again in 1953, suffering tremendous loss. In the last major enemy offensive in July 1953, the Chinese lost approximately 72,000 men. Although the line shifted periodically during this period, it was never wholly broken, and by maintaining a line in Korea, the United Nations entered the armistice negotiations possessing a tangible commodity, occupation of terrain. Next, fighting a violent campaign among the population helped destroy the country. South Vietnamese society possessed no real internal political integrity, and fighting a very violent war inside its borders would not allow any to evolve. The U.S. could provide some space for South Vietnamese institutions to develop by keeping large numbers of PAVN fighters from the southern battlefields, placing the main war in Laos. General Palmer assessed a defensive line would have allowed South Vietnam to develop while keeping the main war in the north, minimizing South Vietnamese destruction. State Department official Norma B. Hanna observed at the time, the political renaissance of South Vietnam will take 10 to 20 years and cannot be accomplished at all except behind a protective screen. Another advantage would have been more precise targeting and less tonnage expended, particularly because in a defense, many of the artillery fires are pre-planned. Numerous accounts during the war recount artillery and other munitions landing on vacant positions because the enemy had already fled. Also, the massive amount of munitions expended looking for an elusive jungle enemy versus the results the U.S. obtained is mind-boggling. For example, and there are several, the 1st Cav Division conducted operations Thayer and Pershing in early 1967. The division fired over 136,000 artillery rounds, 171 B-52 sorties, 2,600 fighter bomber missions, 50,000 pounds of napalm and 35,000 pounds of tear gas. The result? About 1,700 enemy killed in an area the Army described as densely populated. It is unlikely that a blocking position would have created several million refugees. This war fought among civilians increased civilian casualties through stray fire, alienating the population. In 1966, the U.S. Congress cited statistics claiming there were probably 2 civilian casualties for every enemy casualty. This almost certainly worked to the North Vietnamese advantage. Empirical studies show that misapplication of force creates more insurgents. Specific to Vietnam, one study found that, quote, bombing civilians systemically shifted control in favor of the Viet Cong insurgents. Speaking of the Viet Cong, as communist leadership pointed out early in the war, they were largely ineffective until the northern invasion began to empower them. Next, Millions of acres destroyed by defoliant spraying, 1.5 million acres in 1967 alone, including villagers' crops. Another advantage is that defending an ally on a line is a morally defensible concept the American public can understand. Americans viewed the war through the lens of World War II in Korea, where there were front lines which could be understood and followed in news reports. But in Vietnam, that was impossible, as there was no geographic war objective for Americans to follow. News of mines, booby traps, punji stakes, all injuries particularly characteristic of jungle warfare, littered the news and caused up to 20% of soldier injuries early in the war. From an overarching strategic standpoint, the U.S. abandoned several warfighting principles by fighting in the confines of South Vietnam. These principles are age-old military doctrine that represent truce in the practice of war and military operation. The U.S. violated pursuit by prohibiting U.S. military forces to pursue enemy forces into Laos and Cambodia. Clausewitz said, "Next to victory, the act of pursuit is most important in war, and only pursuit of the beaten enemy gives the fruits of victory." The U.S. sacrificed security, which is defined as not allowing the enemy an unexpected advantage. U.S. forces were never secure in South Vietnamese jungles, awaiting ambushes and attacks 88% of the time. Simplicity was never achieved either through the rules of engagement. The North Vietnamese also seized surprise. U.S. forces almost never surprised enemy units. Often, U.S. forces were surprised in the jungle. Maneuver is even questionable. Certainly, U.S. forces maintained adequate maneuver in one sense with its air mobile capability, but this maneuver capability rarely placed the enemy in a positional disadvantage, a preferred outcome of maneuver. With a linear defense in Laos, the U.S. would have had a clear military advantage because the North Vietnamese would have been forced into open battle, where the U.S. almost always won battles. Professor Douglas Pike of the University of California, Berkeley, a leading authority of the Vietnam War, wrote, "The American military performance in Vietnam was particularly impressive. American troops won every significant battle that they fought, a record virtually unparalleled in the history of warfare. This is why forcing the North Vietnamese to fight on ground of U.S. choosing would have been so advantageous." The Joint Chiefs of Staff addressed this early in the war, telling Secretary of Defense McNamara, quote, "Currently, we and the South Vietnamese are fighting the war on the enemy's terms. He has determined the locale, the timing, and the tactics of the battle, while our actions are essentially reactive. One reason for this is the fact that we have obliged ourselves to labor under self-imposed restrictions. These restrictions include keeping the war within the boundaries of South Vietnam," unquote. Now let's dispel some myths about the war that are relevant to this conventional fight argument. We will begin with Lan Cao of the Washington Post. The Viet Cong was not some indigenous, homegrown Southern group. In reality, North Vietnam planned, controlled, and directed the Viet Cong with Soviet Union and Chinese support. Hanoi sent cadres south in the late 1950s and early 1960s to embed into Southern society and create insurrection when the time came. After the Geneva Agreements in 1954 partitioning Vietnam and large Viet Minh units in South Vietnam went back north according to the agreement, these units took by force large numbers of Southern teenage boys with them for indoctrination and later reintroduction to the South, and imposed forced marriages of their fighters upon local Southern girls to establish family bonds. Rufus Phillips, who was with the U.S. mission in Saigon at this time, covers this in his noteworthy book. Bui Tin said the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, was not an independent political movement of the South Vietnamese, rather a creation by Hanoi in 1960. There was only one party, only one army in the war to liberate the South, he said. And yet another counterinsurgency myth. U.S. Ambassador J.R. Bullington, then a U.S. Foreign Service officer assigned to Vietnam in several capacities, including corps during 1965 to 75, argues the South Vietnamese, with massive U.S. assistance, had essentially won the counterinsurgency war by early 1973. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Thomas Ricks writes, quote, "Oddly, the Americans were starting to leave just as their years of struggle were paying off. There is little doubt now that the communists were rapidly losing control of large parts of the South Vietnamese countryside in late 1968 and for the following 3 years." North Vietnamese leaders later confirmed these accounts. General Hong Van Thai later recounted Hanoi's goals for its 1975 strategic plan and the more encompassing two-year 1975-76 strategic plan by listing as the first two goals for both disrupt and defeat the enemy's pacification plan. Thai also admitted that during the final campaign, the political movement was still experiencing difficulties and not yet strong, as the enemy was militarizing their control apparatus in the villages and hamlets. General Tran Van Tra confirmed this, saying the plan in 1975 was to, quote, not fight on a large scale, but be concerned only with disrupting pacification in the Mekong Delta, unquote. That Hanoi's two overarching strategic plans, approved in October 1974, prioritized pacification's defeat, speak to pacification's effectiveness. One of General Giap's aides confessed in 1990 in this interview that the Phoenix program had, quote, ravaged, unquote, the communists. Another communist official, former Justice Minister Trong Nu Thang, said that Phoenix was, quote, dangerously effective, unquote, and in one province, the Viet Cong infrastructure was virtually eliminated. During the last years of the war, North Vietnamese leaders were acutely aware that their common assumption prior to previous offenses had been erroneous of mass South Vietnamese civilian uprising. North Vietnamese General Tran Do said after the Tet offensive, "In all honesty, we didn't achieve our main objective, which was to spur uprisings throughout the South." Why were proposals rejected? First, the proposals early in the war had been rejected because the large footprint of 350,000 or so U.S. Marines and soldiers required to conduct the defensive mission was unthinkable to senior officials who were avoiding a large-scale U.S. commitment in Southeast Asia. One wonders if their thinking would have been different had they known by the end of 1966 U.S. military force levels would be at 385,000 and soon surge to 500,000. Secondly, particularly some in the State Department opposed the plan because it would be an open violation of the 1962 Geneva Accord, which aimed to neutralize Laos. Ambassador Bunker did not see the accord stipulations this way. He cabled President Johnson that the North Vietnamese were clearly violating the treaty and said, in part, North Vietnam is using Laos as the main route for infiltration into South Vietnam. Is it not logical and reasonable, therefore, that South Vietnamese troops should oppose and combat North Vietnamese offensive action by whatever method can be devised in order to prevent the invasion of their country? Third, President Johnson, even though he stated the South Vietnamese were being invaded, was concerned it might draw China into the war.
With a country that's trying to maintain her independence from aggression, that's being invaded.
The fourth reason was that the succession of U.S. ambassadors to Laos, such as William Sullivan and G. McMurtry Godley, strenuously opposed the plan. Officially, they said it would upset diplomatic balances in Laos, but in fact, the ambassadors were de facto commanders for their own secret war in Laos with their own budgets and the ultimate U.S. authority in Laos. Had the U.S. Department of Defense taken responsibility for the fight in Laos, the ambassadors' warfighting authority would have been withdrawn and they would have lost their unchallenged sovereignty of the country. Washington's failure to create a theater-wide unified command for the three countries where the U.S. was fighting, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, hampered U.S. collaboration, policy synchronization, and operations. theater unity of command was never achieved. The Joint Chiefs of Staff identified this problem in January 1964, saying the U.S. positions in these countries do not comprise a compatible and integrated U.S. policy for Southeast Asia. General Westmoreland complained that his authority did not extend past Vietnam's borders, and he recommended a Southeast Asia command to centralize theater operations. The fact that different U.S. agencies or military commanders were in charge in different countries of Southeast Asia meant that U.S. efforts were fragmented and disjointed. Post-war reflection. After the war, several participants weighed in regarding cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1983, Bunker told Norman B. Hanna that in retrospect he was even more certain that our failure to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a strategic mistake of the First Order. William P. Bundy wrote Hanna in 1975 that the more I now reflect upon it, the stronger it seems. Surely we could have held a line across Laos and South Vietnam with significantly fewer men than we eventually deployed to South Vietnam, far less American casualties, and in the end, much greater effect and less bloodshed in the South itself. In conclusion, even if winnable, cutting communist regular force infiltration alone probably would not have won the war, as the overall Vietnam War strategy had other flaws. The U.S. Army barely tried to know and integrate with the Vietnamese people it was defending, as Jeffrey Race documents. And General Westmoreland was perhaps the most intellectually vacant commanding general the U.S. Army produced in the second half of the 20th century, as Thomas Ricks articulates. The list of errors, misjudgments, and deficiencies do not stop here. And because of the U.S. loss, Westmoreland remains perhaps the most maligned senior U.S. commander of the 20th century. Still, one can only wonder what Westmoreland's reputation would be today had the Johnson administration granted his request to fight in Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Thank you very much for joining me.